So some defining characteristics of recent retellings are flipping the story, female friendships, still no parents, still violent, warrior princesses, perhaps no moral needed, non-royal protagonists, and empowerment. So with flipping the story, they'll often, in recent retellings, maybe even switch the gender roles, make the princess the person who fights the dragon or something like that. A lot of recent retellings have more female friendships, and none of the fairy tales we read passed the Bechdel test. None of them at all, so it's nice to see that. There are still no parents. Apparently even in 400 years, we're just like, parents are superfluous to telling good stories. We've talked about warrior princesses. Definitely most fairy tale retellings don't have like a very set moral that a lot of the old tales would have. But I would say that there still is a moral. It's just usually something more general, like be yourself, rather than, if you're vain, your eyes will get plucked out in a freak bird accident. So then the modern stories are less classist. They're not just about royalty. And then there is this apparent pressure on modern retellings to include some type of empowerment that happens to some varying degrees of success, in my opinion. So some criticism of recent retellings is that fairy tales are all anti-feminism, all anti-feminist. That there's criticism of warrior princesses, that they're all damsels in distress, that they create unrealistic expectations for girls, that marriage is portrayed as the only end goal, they're Western-centric, and they don't stay true to the original story. So as far as fairy tales being Western-centric, I would agree with that. You can see from the recent retellings I have up here on the screen, everyone is white. Fairy tales are still very Western-centric. Hopefully in the future we'll start to have some fairy tales that represent more than just people of European descent. The other thing I'd like to address is the concept that they don't stay true to the original story. As we've seen, there really is no original story. We did start with the original fairy tale that I mentioned to you from 1634, but that collector did not invent Cinderella. There are many other tales from before 1634 that have a Cinderella tale, but just not as well developed or well preserved in history. No single person invented the story of Cinderella, so there is no original. Cinderella as a story belongs to a literary canon. All right, so in defense of recent retellings, when they say that they are unrealistic expectations for girls, I disagree with that. I think that fairy tales always have been and always will be like dreams, they're fantasies. For the women from hundreds of years ago, it was a dream of attaining a life where they would have wealth and power and be able to have agency over their own lives. So saying that fairy tales set unrealistic expectations is derivative. They're supposed to do that, that's the fun part. It's completely unfair to place the blame for society's expectation of the young women squarely on fairy tales. Plus, if you look back on history, there are many male fantasy stories, what I would equivocate to male fairy tales. Beowulf, the Epic of Gilgamesh, both stories of nearly invincible godlike men who go on grand adventures and save the world, which might sound familiar. These stories are still being told in today's superhero movies, and yet you don't hear anybody complaining about how Thor is a bad role model for little boys and setting unrealistic expectations for how many muscles they can have. So, this all comes to the question, can fairy tales be feminist? If you claim that fairy tales are all anti-feminist, it's putting women in a pigeonhole that tells them that if they like ancient female stories that tell about the struggles and triumphs of women in the last 400 years, then they're not feminists. Cinderella can wear high heels and go to a ball and fall in love, and that in and of itself is not anti-feminist. What is anti-feminist is telling a woman that a female character is not allowed to do a certain thing because it's not what society wants of her. That she's letting down little girls everywhere by being excited about a new dress. Telling women that they can't like pretty dresses is just as damaging as to insist that the only point they have in life is to marry and bear children. Telling a young woman that she's not allowed to dream of someday falling in love is not feminism. Telling her that if she's ever in distress and needs help, and that's wrong, that's not feminism. Carefully studying the history of traditionally female stories and appreciating their stories and their struggles from the last 400 years, that for me is feminism. Plus, if you dismiss fairy tales as anti-feminist, then you miss some really moving and important messages. Modern fairy tale retellings have a role in the literary canon, the role of telling the same female stories, but for modern women. And plus, when a new message is emboldened in an old familiar tale, it's much more powerful because it's aided with the power of nostalgia, and it feels like advice from an old friend. So, as we look to the future of fairy tales, we must look to the past. When examining the several timeless tales that have been able to survive for the last hundreds of years, it's important to mention that these are a magical few. We read countless tales that I'd never heard of before, and a lot of them were very, very strange. So let's determine why these did not last. So here are our oddities. We've got Hans the Hedgehog, the story of a half-hedgehog, half-man creature who rides a rooster. We've got the Jew and the Brambles, an extraordinarily racist story. We have the Flayed Woman. I'm not going to describe this one to you. I feel like you can get it from the title. These stories have no relevance in the modern world because children don't need to be told anymore not to accidentally chop off their own hands, like the tale of the girl with no hands. While these tales hold very little interest to a modern audience, they're an interesting study, only as a method to see the evolution of what culture finds entertaining as a reflection of cultural values. So, what now? When we look to the future of fairy tales, we look to the past and see the tales we've abandoned and how the ones we've treasured have changed. Tracing these changes, we can see how they are a reflection of cultural views of females. In 1634, for women, making an advantageous marriage was the height of achievement. In 2018, with the third wave of feminism, women are supposed to be free to have agency over their own lives. I think this is reflected very well in a recent Disney retelling of Cinderella. In that movie, Cinderella's mantra is have courage and be kind, which I believe is a good mantra for modern feminism. That women should be able to be free to choose to embrace kindness, a more traditionally female attribute, but also be free to embrace courage and to be strong and to be themselves and make their own decisions about their own lives. So, as we look to the future of fairy tales, knowing how important they've been in the history of women, we can assume that they will continue to change to reflect culture in the lives of women. Hopefully, in the near future, fairy tales will better reflect the diversity of our modern world, as well as continue to portray women as complex individuals.